The old widow never spoke a word, but her silence guarded a secret buried beneath her home for 30 years. When a retired canine froze at her basement door, the truth began clawing its way to the surface. The call came in just before noon. A neighbor hadn't seen Margaret Hensley in over a week. No lights on at night, no curtains drawn, no footsteps on the porch where she usually left out sunflower seeds for the birds. The mail was piling up, and her car hadn't moved. It could have been nothing, maybe a trip, maybe an accident, but the neighbor said something didn't feel right. So Officer Miguel Reyes was sent to check it out. And he brought his partner, Shadow. Shadow was a 5-year-old black German shepherd, lean and quiet, the kind of dog that didn't bark unless it mattered. He'd been trained for military work but retired early after his handler was killed overseas. Reyes took him in 6 months ago, and in that short time, they had become inseparable. Shadow didn't chase tennis balls or play fetch. He was all business, but his instincts had saved Reyes more than once. They arrived at the old house on Maple Drive. It stood crooked among overgrown hedges and yellowing grass. Paint peeled from the wood siding. The air felt heavy, like the whole place had been holding its breath. Reyes knocked twice. No answer. He circled the house, peeking through windows. The kitchen table was set for one. A teacup sat untouched beside an open book. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, just stillness. He called out, "Mrs. Hensley? It's Officer Reyes. We're here to check on you." Silence. Reyes tried the front door. Locked. He checked the side entrance. Also locked. Finally, he found the back door slightly ajar. Shadow sniffed the air. Tail stiff. Ears perked. He didn't move forward until Reyes gave the signal. Inside, the house smelled old but clean. Faint lavender and something else. Something sour. The floorboards creaked under Reyes' boots as they moved through the hallway. He announced himself again. Nothing. Then Shadow stopped. He was in the kitchen now, nose twitching. Reyes watched him carefully. The dog stepped toward a narrow wooden door at the far end of the room. It looked like a closet, but the knob had a keyhole. A thick, rusted bolt had been screwed across the frame. It wasn't a closet. It was the basement. Shadow sat, then stood again. His muscles tensed. His breathing slowed. He stared at the door like it was alive. Reyes whispered, "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't bark. He didn't whine, but his body spoke for him. Every inch of him screamed alert. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Reyes tried the knob. Locked. He knocked on the door. No response. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing but cold air on the other side. Then he saw it. Small scratches around the bolt, like someone had tried to pry it open before. He stepped back, radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 6. I need permission to force entry into a secured area inside the residence. Dog is showing high alert behavior. Basement door is locked and appears tampered with." A moment of static. Then the reply. "Permission granted." Reyes exhaled. He pulled out his baton, braced his shoulder, and slammed against the old wood. Once. Twice. On the third try, the frame cracked and the door swung open. The darkness below breathed out at them, cold and stale. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He stood at the top of the stairs, unmoving, eyes locked on something they couldn't see yet. And in that moment, Reyes understood. They hadn't just walked into an old woman's house. They had stepped into a secret that had waited 30 years to be found. The steps creaked under Reyes' boots as he slowly moved down into the basement. Shadow stayed just ahead of him, his body tense, nose in the air. The basement was colder than it should have been. A sharp chill settled in the space, not just from the damp air, but from something deeper. It smelled like dust, old oil, and forgotten time. Reyes swept his flashlight around the room. Shadows danced along the stone walls. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling pipes. Boxes were stacked in corners. Some collapsed from water damage. A rusty bicycle leaned against an old washer, its tires long gone flat. Nothing screamed danger, but the hairs on Reyes' arms stood up anyway. Shadow moved slowly, carefully. weaving through the clutter with purpose. He wasn't sniffing everything. He wasn't curious. He was following something. Something exact. Reyes followed him past a row of rusted gardening tools and an overturned rocking chair. Shadow stopped at a corner of the room where an old mattress leaned against the wall. He growled once, low and deep, then looked back at Reyes. Reyes moved closer and pushed the mattress aside. Behind it stood a wall that didn't match the others. Most of the basement was made of smooth concrete, aged and gray. But this section, maybe 6 feet wide and 4 feet high, was made of brick, newer brick, laid in sloppy rows, uneven and crusted with pale mortar that hadn't weathered the same way. Reyes leaned in, shining the light close. The bricks didn't reach the ceiling. The edges were rough, like someone built it in a hurry. And the floor in front of it had been scrubbed, cleaner than the rest. Shadow sniffed at the base, then stepped back and sat, head tilted, eyes never leaving the wall. Reyes felt something tighten in his chest. He called it in. Within the hour, backup arrived. 2 forensic officers and a detective joined them in the basement. Reyes stepped aside and let the specialists take over. One of the forensic techs, a young woman with short hair and sharp eyes, ran her fingers over the brick. "This isn't original," she said softly. "It's a patch job." She tapped a few bricks. Hollow behind it. Probably not reinforced. Someone built this to cover something, not to hold anything up. They brought in tools, small hammers and chisels. Carefully, they began to break away the bricks. Dust filled the air. A strange silence fell over the group. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Not mold, not mildew. Something else. Something terrible. The forensic team paused, exchanged glances, then kept working. After 30 minutes, they had opened a hole large enough to see inside. One of them shined a flashlight through the gap. He froze. "Oh God," he whispered. "Bones." Reyes stepped forward. Inside the wall, buried in what looked like old insulation and burlap sacks, was a pile of bones. Human, long bones. A skull, partially covered in dirt. The sockets empty, the jaw still intact. Reyes took a step back. Shadow let out a soft growl, almost like he had known all along. Whoever had sealed that wall had done it with care, but not enough, not for Shadow. And now, a body had been found, a life hidden, a secret uncovered. Something awful had happened here, and this was only the beginning. Margaret Hensley wasn't the kind of woman people noticed much. She wore plain sweaters, soft house shoes, and always kept her hair tied up in a neat bun. The neighbors saw her every so often, sitting on the porch with a blanket across her knees, a cup of tea in her hand, and one of her cats curled at her feet. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was gentle, slow, and tired. Everyone on Maple Drive knew her as the widow. She'd been living in that same old house since anyone could remember. Some said she was sweet, others said she was strange, but most simply thought she was lonely. No kids ever came to visit, no family dropped by for the holidays, just her and the cats and the sound of the wind through the trees. Back in the early 90s, though, things were different. Before Walter Hensley vanished, the house used to be louder. Walter was a large man, broad in the shoulders and quick to anger. He had worked in construction, drank too much beer, and barked commands at Margaret like she was hired help. No one said much at the time, but people heard things through the thin walls and open windows. Shouts, slamming doors, and sometimes long stretches of silence that felt heavier than the noise. Then one day in 1993, Walter was just gone. Margaret told the neighbors he had stormed off after a fight and never came back. She said they argued over money, over his drinking, over a broken sink he never fixed. "He said he was done with me," she told Mrs. Cartwright next door. "Said he'd rather live in the woods than stay in this house one more night." She filed a missing persons report a week later. The police looked into it briefly. Walter had a record, some bar fights, a theft charge from the 80s. Not the kind of man who kept close ties. No one thought it was strange when he didn't call. They figured he had left for good. Maybe he found work in another town. Maybe he was too proud to admit he'd walked out with nothing but the clothes on his back. Eventually, he was declared legally dead. Margaret never moved. She stayed in that same house, slept in the same bed, cooked for one, and kept everything exactly how it had been before. She never changed the wallpaper, never replaced the couch. She even kept Walter's boots by the back door, like he might come home and slip them on again. Some folks thought she was still waiting for him. Others believed she had accepted her life as it was and chose to live quietly with her memories. No one thought to ask more questions. No one wondered why she never dated again, or why she avoided the basement completely. And no one looked too closely when she paid for everything in cash and stopped attending church. Margaret Hensley faded into the background of the neighborhood, just another quiet woman with arthritis and too many cats. But now, after all these years, her quiet life didn't seem so simple anymore. Now people were starting to remember that day in 1993 differently. And it turned out, Margaret hadn't just been living with silence. She had been living with a secret. The house had been sealed off with yellow tape, but Officer Reyes had permission to return. He needed to walk through it again, this time without the noise, without the flashing lights and hurried voices. Just him and Shadow. The old place was quiet, almost too quiet. Dust still hung in the air from the bricks they had pulled down in the basement. The air felt heavier now, like the house was finally breathing again after holding something in for far too long. Shadow moved ahead, sniffing the floor as he went. His ears twitched at every creak of the wood, every shift in the air. Reyes watched him closely. This was more than a normal walk. Shadow was searching again. They made their way to the living room. Shadow froze in front of the old brick fireplace, his body low to the ground, tail stiff. He sniffed the base, then began scratching at the small iron vent near the bottom. "Hey," Reyes said softly. "What's got your attention, boy?" Shadow growled under his breath, then sat down, still staring at the vent like it was hiding something. Reyes knelt beside him and shined a flashlight into the narrow space. Dust, ash, and something else. Something that looked like fabric, old and yellowed, tucked deep inside. Reyes didn't reach for it. Not yet. Shadow got up and started pacing. He circled the room, stopping at the hallway near the stairs. Then he sniffed along the wall, paws tapping lightly against the floorboards. He pressed his nose to the ground and let out a low, uneasy whine. That night, back at Reyes's apartment, Shadow didn't rest. He didn't eat his dinner, didn't curl up in his bed like he usually did. Instead, he stood by the door for hours, ears up, eyes fixed. Just after midnight, he let out a long, mournful howl that made Reyes sit up in bed. "What is it?" he whispered, rubbing his eyes. Shadow didn't answer. He didn't move. He just kept howling. Slow, deep, sad. Reyes had never heard that sound come from him before. The next morning, Reyes visited the hospital. Margaret Hensley lay in a bed surrounded by machines, a thin blanket pulled up to her chest. Her face was pale, her hands still. The nurse said she hadn't woken up since she arrived. Stroke, they said, brought in just in time, but no one knew if she would ever speak again. Reyes looked down at her and whispered, "What were you hiding all this time?" Back at the house, Shadow scratched again at the fireplace vent. He whined at the floorboards. He even sat beside the basement door, staring down into the darkness like he was waiting for something else to appear. Reyes knew that look. Shadow wasn't guessing. He knew. His nose had picked up more than just old bones. Margaret had been living with more than a secret. She had been living above it, walking past it every day, sleeping just steps above the place where a man's life had ended. Shadow hadn't missed it. Not the smell, not the silence. And he was telling Reyes now, something else was down there. Something no one had found yet. The lab results came back 2 days later. The bones found behind the brick wall in the basement were a match. Walter Hensley, missing since 1993, declared dead years ago, but only now truly found. The news spread quickly through the station. What started as a quiet welfare check had turned into a real mystery, one that had been buried for 30 years under dust, brick, and silence. The chief called Officer Reyes into his office that afternoon. Shadow sat at his side, as always, calm but alert. The chief looked tired, his face lined with more than age. He slid a folder across the desk and nodded. "We're reopening the Hensley case. Cold case team wants you on it. They say your dog found the body. Might as well see what else he can uncover." Reyes took the file. Inside were old photos, reports written in faded type, and a name he didn't expect to see: Detective Hank Dobson. Dobson had handled the original investigation back in '93. He was well known in town back then, known for his long memory and even longer questions. He retired 10 years ago and disappeared into a quiet life of fishing and radio baseball games. Reyes found him sitting on his porch that evening, whittling a piece of wood with a dull pocket knife. Dobson looked up as Shadow approached and gave a slow nod. "German Shepherd, huh? Good dog?" "The best," Reyes said. Dobson smiled a little. "Figures. Only a dog would dig up what the rest of us missed." Reyes sat down beside him and opened the old case file. "You worked the Hensley case." "I remember it like it was yesterday," Dobson said, his voice low. "Walter was no saint. Loud, mean, especially when he drank. Cops got called out to that house more than once. Neighbors heard fights, but no one wanted to get involved. Then one day, poof, he's gone." "You suspected Margaret?" Dobson nodded slowly. "I did. She told us he left after an argument, said he slammed the door and never came back. But something didn't sit right with me. The house was too clean. Her answers too calm, like she'd rehearsed them. I couldn't prove anything, though. No body, no weapon, no confession, just a gut feeling." Reyes leaned back. "You think she killed him?" Dobson didn't answer right away. He stared off across the yard, watching a squirrel dart across the grass. "No," he said finally. "I think she knew what happened. But I don't think she was the one who put him in that wall." Reyes frowned. "Then who did?" Dobson's eyes narrowed. "That's the part that always bugged me. There was talk, quiet whispers, that Walter was involved in things he shouldn't have been. Gambling, maybe something worse. The night he disappeared, there were tire marks in the alley behind the house. Fresh ones. Never got a match." Reyes looked down at Shadow, who was now watching a butterfly flutter past the porch. "So she kept the secret," Reyes said softly. "All these years. She lived with him buried below her. Maybe to protect herself," Dobson said. "Maybe to protect someone else." Reyes closed the file. The case wasn't just cold. It was frozen, locked behind fear and silence. But Shadow had cracked it open. And they were going to find out what else had been left to rot in the dark. The attic was hotter than the rest of the house, even with the windows closed. Dust floated through the beam of Reyes' flashlight as he climbed up the narrow steps. The boards groaned under his feet. Most of the attic was filled with old boxes, holiday decorations, and forgotten furniture covered in sheets. A stack of yellowed newspapers sat in the corner, untouched for decades. Shadow had insisted on coming. He barked once at the base of the attic door, then climbed slowly behind Reyes. The moment they stepped inside, the dog's head lifted. His nose twitched. He turned left and padded past an old rocking chair, past a broken lamp, and stopped at a corner where the insulation had been pulled back in small patches. Reyes watched him closely. "You smell something?" Shadow scratched at the wall gently, then backed up. His eyes didn't leave the spot. Reyes crouched down and pulled away a handful of insulation. Behind it, wedged between two beams, was a bundle wrapped in soft, faded flannel. He pulled it out carefully and unfolded the fabric. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the cover cracked with age, but still intact. He sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened the first page. January 4th, 1990. The handwriting was neat but small, with every line carefully written. The first few entries were simple. Margaret talked about the weather, about feeding the cats, about missing her sister who had moved to another state. But as Reyes flipped through the pages, the tone changed. March 12th, 1991. Walter came home late again. Smelled like beer. He didn't say anything, just dropped his boots in the hallway and turned on the TV. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said no and slammed the door. There were more entries like that. Short, but sharp. Descriptions of loud arguments, of cold shoulders, of small bruises Margaret never explained to anyone. She never wrote anything too direct, like she was afraid someone might read it. But between the lines, the truth was clear. August 2nd, 1992. Sometimes I think the house is listening. I say something out loud, and then I hear the floor creak upstairs. Even when Walter is asleep beside me, I keep the cats close. I trust them more than anyone else. Reyes turned to the last pages. They were from the spring of 1993. April 15th, 1993. He yelled at me for opening the mail, said it was his business. I found a letter from someone named C. Winters. It mentioned the girl again. I don't know what it means, but I don't like it. The final entry came 2 weeks later. May 20, 1993. I heard something in the basement last night. A sound I've never heard before, like something being dragged. I didn't go down there. I don't think I ever will again. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. I tried to be brave. I did what I had to do. Reyes closed the journal slowly. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a woman living in fear. This was a woman living with something buried, not just in the ground, but in her soul. He looked at Shadow, who was now lying quietly beside him. Once again, the dog had found the truth no one else could see. And whatever had happened in that basement, it wasn't over yet. The forensics team returned 2 days after the journal was found. They wanted to go over the basement one more time. Now that they knew what they were looking for, they weren't just searching for bones. They were searching for signs of a story, a timeline, a truth that had stayed hidden for too long. Officer Reyes stood at the top of the basement stairs while Shadow waited beside him. The air still carried that faint smell of rust and mold, but now it felt different. Like the house itself was slowly giving up its secrets. One of the crime scene analysts called out from below, "You're going to want to see this." Reyes walked down the creaking steps, Shadow right behind him. The wall where Walter's remains had been found was now completely open. The bricks had been cleared, and the hollow space behind it fully exposed. There wasn't much left, just dry dirt, some pieces of rotting cloth, and a thin layer of dust that had settled over the years. But on the back side of the concrete wall, near the bottom, were deep scratches. They didn't look like tool marks. They weren't neat or straight. They were wild, crooked. Some cut in wide arcs, others clustered together, as if made by shaking hands. The analyst knelt beside them, brushing gently with a soft brush. "These aren't from rodents," she said. "They're from fingernails." She held up a plastic evidence bag. Inside were 3 broken fingernails, some with bits of dried tissue still clinging to them. Reyes stared at the wall, his throat tight. The scratches told a silent, awful story. Someone had been alive in that space. Someone had tried to get out. Shadow stepped closer to the wall and sniffed. His ears flattened, and he let out a low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, just a sound of discomfort, like something in the air disturbed him. The analyst noticed. "Your dog doesn't like this spot, does he?" "No," Reyes said softly. "He didn't like it the first time either." Shadow backed away a few steps, his eyes fixed on the scratches. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stood there, tense, watching. One of the techs took a sample of the concrete surface for lab testing. "We'll check for blood or skin cells in the grooves," she said. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't quick. He didn't just die. He suffered." Reyes nodded slowly, but something still didn't feel right. The size of the space behind the wall was bigger than needed for just one body, and the scratch marks, some were too small. The arcs too tight, like made by smaller hands. Shadow moved again. This time he walked toward the far corner of the basement. He sniffed along the floor, paused, then began to scratch lightly at a section of the concrete. Reyes walked over, heart pounding. "What are you trying to tell me now?" he whispered. because if Walter Hensley didn't die alone in that wall, then someone else had been there too. And Shadow could still smell the truth. It was after midnight when Officer Reyes sat alone in his apartment, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Shadow lay by the door, eyes half closed, but Reyes could tell the dog wasn't sleeping. His ears twitched every now and then, his breathing slow but alert. Something about the last few days had stirred up more than old bones. It had stirred something in Shadow, too. Reyes leaned back on the couch, rubbing his tired eyes. He couldn't stop thinking about the scratch marks on the wall, the broken fingernails, the journal in the attic. And now Shadow, scratching at the far end of the basement floor, sniffing like something was still hidden. There was something else bothering him, something he had been trying to ignore. When he first adopted Shadow, the file from the military said the dog had been retired early. It listed the reason simply as behavioral unpredictability. There had been an incident overseas. No real details, just a brief note. Handler injured during mission. Shadow showed signs of aggression. No further deployment recommended. But Reyes had worked with canine units before. He knew the difference between aggression and fear. He'd never seen Shadow lash out without reason. Never growled at a stranger unless something felt off. Never barked just to make noise. The dog was calm, steady, and smart. Smarter than most people. That so-called incident had been more about fear than behavior. The old handler, a man named Sergeant Denton, had been injured during a raid in the middle of the night. Reyes had spoken to him once, back when he first considered taking Shadow in. Denton told him the dog had pulled him away from a building just before it collapsed, saving his life. But when medics tried to get close, Shadow wouldn't let them. He'd stood over Denton, teeth bared, growling, ready to fight anyone who came near. He was protecting me, Denton had said on the phone. But they didn't see it that way. They thought he'd snapped. He hadn't. He just didn't trust them. Now, after everything Shadow had led him to in Margaret's house, Reyes couldn't help but wonder. What if Shadow wasn't just reacting to scents in the basement? What if he was remembering something? The sealed wall, the hidden journal, the fingernails in the concrete, the scratch marks too small to belong to a grown man. Shadow had been trained to detect danger, to find explosives, bodies, anything out of place. But more than that, he had survived war. He had survived grief, loss, confusion, and fear. And somehow, through it all, he still had the strength to protect and guide. Reyes looked down at the dog, who now lifted his head and met his gaze. "You remember more than I think, don't you?" he whispered. Shadow didn't move, but his eyes said everything. He wasn't afraid of what he had found in that basement. He was afraid of what they hadn't found yet. And Reyes finally understood. This wasn't about one dead man anymore. It was about the truth that had stayed buried for far too long. And Shadow was the only one who still knew where to dig. It was raining again when Officer Reyes returned to the Hensley house. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves, and thunder rolled softly in the distance. Shadow jumped out of the patrol car and stood still in the driveway, nose pointed toward the house, ears high and alert. He didn't wait for a command. He walked straight to the front porch, then toward the living room, where the old fireplace stood. Reyes followed quietly, his boots damp from the walk across the yard. He had learned to trust Shadow without question. Whatever the dog was sensing, it was important. More than once, Shadow had proven he didn't follow trails without reason. Inside, the house was cold, empty. Dust clung to the walls like the house itself was holding its breath. Shadow sniffed around the fireplace again. Then he stopped. His paw tapped the hearthstone gently, like he knew something was hidden just beneath. Reyes knelt down beside him. The hearthstone was wide and heavy, but cracked in the center. He grabbed a flashlight, shining it along the edges. That was when he noticed a thin gap, barely wide enough for a coin. With effort, he lifted the stone, sliding it aside. Beneath it was a small wooden board, charred at the edges as if it had survived a fire. Reyes picked it up carefully. It was soft with age, but something was carved into it. A single word, written in small, shaky letters. Lucy. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. The Hensleys had never had children. No one had ever mentioned a daughter, a niece, not even a godchild. So, who was Lucy? Reyes pulled out his phone and called the station. He asked the clerk on duty to check missing persons reports from the early 90s, anything connected to the name Lucy in their area. It took less than 10 minutes for the answer to come back. Lucy Greer, 6 years old, reported missing on September 17, 1992, last seen walking down Maple Drive, just 3 houses away from the Hensley home. She had been on her way home from school. She never made it. The case had gone cold. No leads, no suspects. Her photo had once been posted in grocery stores, on telephone poles, and in the newspaper. A smiling girl with dark curls and missing front teeth. Over the years, the case faded from public memory. Just another tragic story left behind. Reyes stared at the name burned into the board. It hadn't just been hidden. It had been placed there, protected. Shadow sat beside him, his head low, watching. His body was still, but his eyes were sharp. He had led Reyes here for a reason. Reyes whispered, "Is this what you were trying to tell me all along?" The house wasn't just hiding the death of a man. It was hiding the memory of a child. A name, long forgotten, carved by someone who didn't want her to disappear completely. And now that name was back in the light. Rain tapped gently on the windows as Reyes spread the old blueprints across the kitchen table in the Hensley house. The pages were yellowed and cracked at the corners, rolled tightly and forgotten in a filing cabinet at City Hall. One of the clerks had remembered the house from years ago and pointed him toward a box labeled Maple Drive, pre-1995. Reyes had taken it with him without thinking much of it, but now, looking at the lines and sketches on the paper, he saw something that stopped him cold. A root cellar. It was drawn just off the main basement, a small square space labeled cold storage. But in the current layout of the house, that space didn't exist. There was no doorway, no trapdoor, not even a bump in the wall to suggest it had ever been there. And stranger still, no renovation permits had been filed. No records of work done in or around the basement. It was like someone had erased the room on purpose. Shadow stood beside him, ears perked, tail still. When Reyes looked at the dog, it felt like he already knew. Like he had known all along, there was more to find. Reyes called for a search team the next morning. They brought tools, scanners, and a small camera to inspect behind the walls. Reyes led them straight to the basement, to the far side where Shadow had scratched just days before. The air was colder here, still, like time had stopped. It didn't take long. Behind the wall where Walter's body had been found, behind layers of brick and concrete, they found it. Another wall. This one, older, rougher, made of uneven stones and wooden beams. They used small hammers and chisels, working slowly to avoid damage. When the last board was removed, the flashlight beams caught a narrow, hidden space. It was small, barely the size of a walk-in closet. Inside was a rusted metal crib, its bars bent and broken in places. An old quilt, eaten through by time, lay in a heap beside it. In one corner sat a single dusty child's shoe, pink with a faded white flower. And on the dirt floor, half buried beneath the rubble, were small bones. Reyes stepped back, his heart pounding. He felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Shadow didn't bark. He moved slowly into the space, nose low to the ground. He sniffed the crib, then lay down next to it, his eyes on the shoe. The room was silent, except for the hum of the equipment and the quiet breaths of the officers around them. No one spoke. No one needed to. DNA tests came back a week later. The bones were confirmed as Lucy Greer's. After more than 30 years, her name would finally be removed from the missing persons list. Reyes looked at the file in his hands, then at Shadow, resting quietly by the door. They hadn't just solved a case. They had brought a little girl home. The storage box was hidden in the back of Margaret's closet, under a stack of wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Reyes found it by accident while going through the house one last time before it was turned over to the court. He wasn't expecting anything. He thought everything had already been found. But Shadow had stopped in front of the closet door, not growling, not scratching, just sitting there, staring. It was enough for Reyes to open the door and take a second look. The box was metal, old and dented, with a rusted latch. Inside were things that looked almost ordinary. A bundle of black and white photographs, a wedding invitation with yellowed edges, 2 faded war medals still pinned to their velvet holders. But underneath it all was a small cassette tape, wrapped in tissue paper and marked in shaky handwriting with a single word: play. Reyes brought it to the station, where an evidence tech transferred it to a digital file. They sat together in a small room, the lights dimmed, the recorder set in the middle of the table. The tape began with static, low and crackling. Then came the sound of someone moving, footsteps, something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then a man's voice, Walter's voice, angry, slurred. "You don't tell me what to do in my own house," he growled. There was another voice, a child, soft, frightened. "Please, I want to go home," the little girl whispered. Then a loud crash, the sound of a struggle. And then screaming, Walter screaming. It went on for several seconds, sharp, panicked. Then a thud. Then silence. A long one. Finally, Margaret's voice came through. Not soft like the neighbors remembered. Not tired or gentle. It was broken, shaky, but strong. "No more," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." More silence followed. The tape clicked softly, then ended. Reyes sat still, hands folded, eyes on the floor. The room felt colder, somehow. Margaret had kept everything. The medals from her husband's service, their wedding memories, and this, proof of what had happened that night. Proof of what Walter had done. The truth was now clear. Walter hadn't just hurt Margaret. He had taken Lucy too, a girl who lived only a few doors down. No one had ever connected them. No one had looked hard enough. Margaret had lived with that truth for 30 years. She had slept above it, cooked above it, greeted neighbors on the porch like everything was fine. But in the dark, she had buried 2 secrets, one born of terror, the other of guilt. Reyes looked at Shadow, lying at his feet. The dog lifted his head, as if he too understood what had just been heard. "You did good," Reyes whispered. They had finally found the missing voice in the story. And it had said everything that needed to be said. The hospital room was quiet the morning Margaret Hensley passed away. No machines beeped, no voices echoed in the hallway. A nurse had checked on her just after sunrise and found her still, hands folded gently over a blanket, her eyes closed like she had simply drifted off in sleep and never returned. She never spoke again, not after the truth came out, not after they found the bones in the root cellar, not after the tape was played. Reyes had visited her 3 times. Each time he sat by her bed and told her what they had discovered, about Lucy, about Walter, about the things she had hidden for 30 years. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he talked anyway. He told her that Shadow had led them to the fireplace, then to the second wall in the basement, and finally to the child she had tried to protect long after everyone else forgot she was ever missing. The day after her funeral, Reyes returned to the house one last time. It was nearly empty now, the furniture removed, the floors bare. But Shadow walked through it with purpose, nose low, tail calm, as if checking each room one more time, not for danger but for peace. Outside, a light wind blew across the overgrown yard. Reyes and Shadow made their way to the small cemetery just behind the town church. A new headstone had been placed there, polished and simple. 2 names carved side by side. Lucy Greer, 1986 to 1992. Margaret Hensley, 1939 to 2023. Beneath the names were 5 words. They were never really alone. Shadow sat quietly in front of the stone. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He simply looked at it, ears forward, eyes steady. Reyes knelt beside him and placed a small flower, just a single daisy, at the base of the stone. "She kept your name alive," he said softly to Lucy, "and you gave her a reason to hold on." For Margaret, it had never been about justice. It had been about protection. She couldn't save Lucy's life, but she could guard her memory. She could keep the truth from being erased. And in doing so, she had also saved the town from forgetting what it meant to care. Shadow stood, gave a small huff, and looked toward the trees beyond the fence. There was nothing left to find. No more secrets in the walls. No more names waiting in the dark. Back in town, people started talking differently about the house on Maple Drive. Not as the place where something terrible happened, but as the place where something brave was finally brought to light. They spoke of Margaret not only as the woman who kept to herself, but as someone who carried a heavy truth no one else had the strength to hold. And they spoke of Shadow, not just as a canine, not just as a dog, but as the one who knew, the one who led them to the truth when no one else was listening. The silent guardian who gave a missing girl her name back. The dog that told the truth. Did this story move you? Then let us know by giving it a thumbs up. And if you want to hear more stories about brave animals like Shadow, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community.